Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 17th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And before we get into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. As I always say at the top of the show, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download as long as we can keep making episodes. We're on episode 577 right now. And so your support has made this show possible for these 10 plus years. I can't believe it. The platform we use currently is Patreon, and you can pledge your support on an episodic basis. Any amount helps to pay for the folks who make this show keep going. This week, I want to thank the top patrons, including Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Joseph Lamore, Anu Badavaj, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so much. And there's so many more of you who didn't denote the tier and, for the shout out at the top of the show, or who give on a different basis. And I just want to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart. You keep the show going. And your support has meant so much to us. Let's get into it. This week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Ellen Wohl. She is a University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Geosciences at Colorado State University. She has written several books, and she has a new one out called Following the Bend: How to Read a River and Understand Its Nature. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Ellen Wohl. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So you are a distinguished professor in the Department of Geosciences at Colorado State University. You've written several books. And, like I often when I have the opportunity to speak with scientists who also write trade publications, like popular publications within the sciences, before we get into the content of the book, I love to know just a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are. Have you always been interested in the geosciences? Is that where you started, or did your path meander a bit?
I have a pretty straight path, unlike actual rivers, which do meander. I've always been interested in the natural sciences, but I actually started, at least for my first semester, in biology, thinking I would be an ecologist, but then I switched to geology. So it's always been, the interest has always been in some form of natural science and natural history.
And so you switched over to geology, but of course you do describe concepts from, like stream and wetland ecology. Is that something where you collaborate often with other scientists, or is it just kind of still an interest of yours and you like to keep up to date?
Both of those. I do tend to collaborate a lot with ecologists who work in the active channel and in the floodplain. They're usually called riparian ecologists. But I do think it's kind of interesting that what seemed like I might be diverging from my original major or interest in ecology, I've looped back around. And so I keep up with the stream ecology literature, and I also collaborate actively with people in that discipline.
And so just for those who maybe haven't spent any time in any science departments in the past, the distinction here is that when we talk about ecology, we're talking about ecosystems, so living organisms that are, feeding and preying and doing all the things that living organisms do within a system. And when we talk about geology, we're talking about like streams and rocks and mountains and the kind of substrate of the earth.
Exactly. And my area in geology is called geomorphology, which is the study of Earth surface processes and landforms. So I focus on rivers. And a lot of people don't care at all about how water or sediment moves downstream, except as those movements influence living organisms, whether it's us, humans, or fish, or something else. And conversely, the stream ecologists care a lot about the habitat and the disturbances that affect the organisms that they're studying. So it's a natural collaboration.
Yeah, that does make sense. And obviously it's complicated stuff because it involves a lot of natural history, but it leads up to how things exist today. And also, there's an engineering component to it too, right? Like we're living in a time and have been for hundreds of years, thousands of years really, where human activity, intentional human activity, directly impacts what we think of as, quote, natural processes.
Absolutely. There's almost nothing we can do that doesn't impact rivers because they integrate everything in the landscape. So you may be up at the top of a hilltop or a mountain, but if you're changing the vegetation cover, the native land cover, you're influencing the water and the sediment and the dissolved chemicals that will eventually go into the stream. And then there's all the deliberate things that we do and have done for centuries, like diverting water, creating dams, building artificial levees.
Mm. Do you remember what first kind of piqued your interest specifically in, rivers and bodies of water?
I think every person I've ever met likes rivers at some level. So it was kind of inevitable. But I do remember something that happened when I was a child. My father taught high school science, and we were down in a natural area that was by the Rocky River. I grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And there had been a large flood that had completely reconfigured the gravel bars there. And I don't know how old I was, probably less than 10, but I was very indignant because I thought people had been down there with bulldozers messing around in this natural park. And of course, it wasn't. It was a flood that did that. But that made me think about how rivers, well, I wouldn't have put it this way when I was less than 10, but how rivers are dynamic and they change through time and space.
Yeah. And so you were always sort of thinking about that then as you continued with your academic journey. I'm curious what your focus was in graduate school. Like what kinds of research questions were you asking for your dissertation, for example? And then did that evolve into your work as a professor, or have you kind of switched gears a few times?
I would say I've switched gears several times. If
Mhm.
you've ever heard the term anastomosing river, it's a river with secondary channels that branch and rejoin downstream. I've had an
Mm.
anastomosing research course. I started looking at prehistoric flood sediments in northern Australia, in the tropical region of Australia. And that was heavily influenced by what my PhD advisor worked on. He was known for working on prehistoric flood sediments. I was trying to use those sediments to reconstruct the size and the timing of floods that were associated with dissipating tropical cyclones. And I continued to work on that for a little bit after I came to Colorado State. But that was the first of the bifurcations in research interests, went from the paleo flood record or the prehistoric flood record to the details of the canyons in which those sediments were preserved. I became really interested in bedrock channel forms and processes. And there have been multiple bifurcations since then.
Thinking about your major professor's research interest area, I can't help but notice, right? We're recording this a few weeks before it goes to air. And so I'm having to prognosticate a little bit here, but just as we're talking, I got a New York Times alert in my inbox that Hurricane Melissa has made landfall in Jamaica, and the speeds are around 185. So they're saying that it's one of the strongest Atlantic Category 5 storms on record. And I can't imagine that on a small island, like a Caribbean island like that, that the entire sort of um, uh, geology of the island must be affected by this much water being dumped this quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, take your pick. We have quite a litany now, most recently in the US, Helene.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, any landscape, when you dump that much water on it that fast with intense and widespread precipitation, you're going to see a very dramatic response in terms of hill slopes becoming unstable, so debris flows and landslides, and then flooding in river valleys. Um, yeah, it's going to be very hazardous for people in that
Yeah.
area.
And so you can look back at the geologic history of a region and tell the difference between what might be considered a flash event, like a very quick change, versus something that happens across geologic timescale, like slow, steady erosion just from, sediment.
Yes, sometimes you can. It depends
Mm.
on how well preserved the sediments are. But in the types of sediments that I was working in, for example, in Northern Australia, you could see the depositional signature, if you like, from individual floods. There were many of them over thousands of years, but they're well preserved. If you have a more gradual change, it can sometimes be harder to see a sedimentary record of that unless you have a really nice setting like the sediments in a lake where the sediment comes in and it doesn't get disturbed so much. But
I
you can
see.
tell the difference in different types of events.
Yeah. So we could obviously talk about geologic history for the entire hour, but I do want to get a little bit into the topic of your book itself and sort of the way like it's contextualized or the way it's positioned for the reader. Like every single one of us on the planet has encountered a river before. Some of us have been near really large and kind of overwhelmingly impressive rivers, and some of us maybe have a small stream or a creek or something near our homes. But everybody who's walked on the planet has seen flowing water before. But probably most of us haven't, had the eye, I guess you could say, or the background knowledge to really understand or appreciate certain aspects of it. So, was the intention of following the bend really to bring kind of a mindfulness to the viewer or the reader, bring like a deeper understanding so that as we are encountering these these things that we all encounter in our lives, we can really appreciate how magical they are?
Absolutely. I mean, you could apply this to anything in the indoor world or the outdoor world, but you can look at the surface of things and maybe think they look attractive or they're useful, but I find much more satisfaction in understanding how things work. So the book is aimed at people who want to look at a river and say, well, why does it look like that? Why does it have meanders? Or why is it boulders here and sand upstream or downstream? And I was trying to write it as broadly as possible so that people could use this to look at the Amazon or the Mississippi
Mm.
or the headwater stream in their backyard and from the desert to the wettest regions on Earth. There are consistent patterns that occur in rivers, and it's not that difficult, I think, to understand them if you have a little bit of background information. So that's what I was
Mhm.
aiming at.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what's your experience with rivers? Maybe I'd love to know both your personal, but then your professional, because I can imagine you have observed and worked with, like you mentioned, the tiniest creeks to the largest river systems on the planet.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the non work first. Like a lot of people, I really enjoy playing on rivers. So I like paddling. I've been on big river trips. I had the chance to go down the Amazon on a natural history trip for 3 weeks. And when you're out hiking or backpacking, or in winter snowshoeing or cross country skiing, you see the smaller channels. And I've always been fascinated by all aspects of them. In terms of work, I've been fortunate. I've been able to work all over the world. The project I was doing 2 days ago was looking at very small channels that are maybe 3 or 4 feet wide near where I live. But I've also worked on some very large rivers. And I've looked at a variety of things over the course of my career, which has been long. At this point, I'm approaching retirement. I've been doing this for decades. But I've looked at how water moves downstream and the forces it exerts. I've looked at how sediment moves downstream, looked at the influence of living organisms like trees, beaver, so a variety of different things.
Yeah. And so how do you even know where to start with a book like this? Like how did you figure out how to organize it? Was it informed by the way that you lay out your teaching or your work with your students or even just your personal research? Or was it more informed by like working with an editor and them helping you be like, okay, this is what like a normal person is going to need to know?
It was really informed by my teaching. I teach graduate level courses in my area, which is, to give you a mouthful, fluvial geomorphology, which just means river form and process.
Mm,
So I wanted to start at the broadest scale. So I started with the hydrologic cycle. How does water even get into rivers? And then tried to systematically, in each chapter, explore different aspects of a river. So how does that water move downstream and shape the channel? How does it move sediment? How do living organisms, aquatic insects or fish, interact with that moving water? How does the water chemistry change, or what influences the chemicals that are dissolved in the water or the water temperature? So I was trying to do it systematically by different components of what you might think of as a river system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how deep did you feel like you were really able to go? I find a lot of times when we talk about public science communication versus the I don't know, the lexicon and the level at which we talk with our students or with our colleagues, there can be a really big disconnect. And so obviously it takes more words to describe something to an audience that doesn't have the background vocabulary, even if conceptually it's completely understandable. It just takes up more space, which often leaves less space in in a book to be able to get deep into concepts. So how did you choose like what to include and what was sort of beyond the scope?
Well, I like to think of some of my friends and family who are not scientists while I'm
Hmm.
writing, and if I think their eyes would be starting to glaze if I go into too much detail, that's a good reason to pull back.
Yeah, yeah.
When you write a trade book, there's usually a certain length limit that the publishers are looking for, on the order of 40 to maybe at most 70,000 words. For scientists, I don't know, historians and biographers get away with a lot. They write massive books, which I enjoy reading, but I've never been allowed to write a book that long. So it was that balancing of I don't want to lose the reader's interest, but I want to provide some specific examples to help people understand some of these more, let's say, nebulous concepts like
Hmm.
energy distribution in a stream, and keep it at a level that will engage people who are not scientists and really just want to be able to understand a landscape or river that they're looking at without knowing the details of the physics or the chemistry.
Oh, right. Yeah, because even if you describe something kind of in a all-encompassing way, there's always going to be a layer deeper where you can discuss the, like you mentioned, the chemistry or the physics or the math, or like
Mm-hmm.
there's always going to be more. And at a certain point, you do have to stop and hope that that's enough to whet somebody's appetite. So I'm curious about that. How do you whet somebody's appetite about a river? Like, yes, we talked at the beginning. Everybody's around, flowing water. Everybody's been entranced by it. But some people are like, I don't care. Some people are like, I look at that, it doesn't impress me. I don't. I'd rather look at my phone. How do you reach people like that?
You may not be able to. Um, but I think the thing I'd say is I try to keep in the forefront of my mind and refer to it repeatedly throughout anything I write, that this whole idea of humans and nature being separate is completely false. We
Hmm.
are enmeshed in nature, we are fundamentally dependent on it. We can't survive without water. And there are places where all the drinking water and water for agriculture comes from the groundwater, but in a lot of places it comes from rivers. So we better pay attention to rivers. If we don't, they might flood and kill us, or they might
Hmm.
suddenly switch to a different location on the floodplain and destroy our property or our houses, or we might find ourselves without sufficient fresh water to drink. So we depend on rivers, whether we explicitly acknowledge that or not. And it behooves us to understand how they operate and what keeps them healthy, if you like, and functional.
I live in Los Angeles, and the history of the LA River is fascinating. It's something that I find some people don't even know that LA has a river, but the people who do know that LA has a river, I will often find they have like a love-hate relationship with the LA River. The LA River was, and I didn't even realize this, but it was a natural river that kept flooding the city in a really dangerous way. And so then the Army Corps of Engineers came in and basically just encased the whole thing in concrete. And so when people see the LA River, they don't think it's a real river. They think it's like a culvert, like, just that it was completely human made. And now it just catches water and dumps it straight out to sea. We don't get the benefit of the water that it holds during, I mean, it hardly ever rains here, but when it does rain, we actually get quite a flow. You can kayak portions of the LA River. I've done it before. It's quite beautiful when you walk along it. There's a whole, as we mentioned, ecology, even though it is, wrapped in concrete. But it's interesting that I feel like in some ways the LA River is sort of on an extreme side of what we talked about before, that there's nothing that human activity hasn't touched. But I sometimes worry that human activity to affect a change that is beneficial, right? We don't want to flood out the city. We don't want people to die in horrible floods. Also has a lot of unintended consequences, which is that in a place where we're stricken with drought, we're just washing all our water out to sea.
You have just opened a giant can of worms with the LA River, but it's perfect because it exemplifies why I think people need to understand and care about rivers. So it was once upon a time a river that had a natural forest growing along it, or what ecologists would call a riparian corridor, a riverside forest. As you mentioned, as population density and the density of the infrastructure increased, there were flooding hazards. So the approach was to completely stabilize the channel in the concrete system. And that has been the approach to rivers around the world for the last century. That created a whole series of unintended consequences. The sediment that comes out of the mountains in Southern California that used to go down the LA River to replenish the beaches doesn't go there anymore. There's things like detention basins to limit debris flows and flash floods from damaging houses and other buildings up in the mountain slopes. So the sediment is trapped. Part of the reason there were problems with that river is that a river has a certain amount of energy that's a function of how much water is flowing down it and how steep a slope it's flowing down. It can expend that energy in different ways, but one of those ways is carrying sediment. So if there's no sediment to be carried, if it's being trapped in detention basins up in the headwaters, there's more energy in the water to erode the channel banks and bed. That creates problems. Meanwhile, the sediment isn't going to the coast, so you have problems with beach loss or sand. The loss of sand depletes the sand beaches, and then you have to do artificial beach replenishment that's very expensive and has to be done repeatedly. And this is one example. The water also moves downstream very fast, as you mentioned, so it's a boom or bust situation that you've set up. So because of that, particularly within the last 2 to 3 decades, people in mostly the industrialized regions of Europe and Asia and North America are starting to back off and say, we have to rethink how we manage rivers or live with rivers. And one of the very important trends in river restoration now is to remove some of that stabilization and return some of the historic floodplain to the river so that when you do have a large flood, which we are going to continue to have into the future, there's some accommodation space. Now, it's harder once you've got an urban area and there's high value property and infrastructure right next to the channel. But gradually, if you can widen that corridor down which floods can occur, you can have riparian plants growing there. You may be able to improve water quality, bring back some of the organisms like fishes that lived in the river, and you will fundamentally decrease the flood hazards. There's been an upward increasing trend of flood damages adjusted for inflation in the United States and around the world with time. And it's not mostly because floods are getting worse. It's mostly because we're encroaching on rivers and not giving them the space to flood. So the LA River, to me, exemplifies engineering trends for the past 150 years, including the current emphasis on trying to dial back some of our control of rivers and our encroachment on them.
Oh, yeah. It's so interesting. We are often at the bleeding edge here in LA. So we make our mistakes first, but hopefully we try to correct them first. And I've seen some really interesting projects, obviously, like city projects, state projects, and even art projects working towards utilizing river water for different reasons, or even these projects where they're basically just punching huge holes in the concrete. So they're not completely trying to change the course of the river, but just allow at least some of that water to saturate back into the land as opposed to just all going straight out to sea. it is really interesting, and it's one of those perfect examples, just like we've talked about P22, our resident mountain lion who died a few years ago. But when we have these like urban ecology or urban wildlife uh, stories, like public interest stories, it's a really great way for the community to become interested in these natural phenomena and to get involved in their community, right? The LA River is beloved by so many people, just like P22 was beloved by so many people, and a lot of money has been raised to help improve our ecology and improve our natural resources because of that interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and ideally, you get people engaged in caring about and influencing natural systems before there's a disaster, when something like a river is viewed as, I don't know, a source of danger and destruction. People can forget how much the river supplies during other times of the year. So if you can develop that sense of ownership, stewardship, whatever you want to call it, I think that can help a lot in making people aware of and care about rivers.
For sure. I'm curious. I know I'm taking this in so many directions that are not specific to your book, but you are a wealth of information. I recently saw the documentary about Hurricane Katrina. I grew up in Texas, so next door to the devastation of Katrina, but it was just at the right time where a lot of displaced people were coming over and joining. Like, I think I was in college at the time, joining high school and college classes. A lot of people were like living with neighbors and living with friends, and it was interesting watching sort of the new documentaries that have come out that shared a different, more maybe like forest for the trees view of exactly what happened and what went wrong, as opposed to just the news that we were following at the time, which had a lot of bias. I'm not sure how much you know about the floods in New Orleans due to those levees breaking, but I'm curious if that's sort of another example where, at the time when the hurricane hit, like the water retreated, and it did, like, people didn't think the flood was going to happen. That all happened after the levees broke, where there was a delay, and then just all hell broke loose because of that. And is that an engineering failure? I mean, I bring it up because you mentioned we want to know these things before a natural disaster occurs. And what a kind of perfect example of a situation where people thought they were safe, they thought they were protected, they did what they were, quote, supposed to do, and still it wasn't enough.
That is unfortunately a really tragic example of something that was highly predictable. There were scientific papers written by geologists and geomorphologists saying this is going to happen. And they were completely right. And it's also a large-scale version of what I was talking about with the LA River. So I said the sediment that would be coming out of the mountains and going down to replenish the beaches is no longer making that journey for the most part. In the Mississippi River, most of the whole drainage network, so it's whatever it is, 48% of the continental United States, I think, the surface area is in that drainage.
Wow.
Most of the water comes from the eastern and central parts, so from the Ohio, the Illinois, and the Mississippi itself. Most of the sediment comes from the Missouri River catchment in my half of your half too, the western half of the country. And there are a series of 8 very large dams in the Missouri now that trap most of that sediment. So there's sediment starvation. There's a great phrase one of my colleagues came up with. He called it hungry waters. They have energy, but they don't have the weight that the sediment to carry to use some of that energy, so they're very erosive. There's sediment that no longer reaches the Mississippi Delta, and a delta is a depositional area where a river drops its sediment as it enters a lake or the ocean. That sediment tends to be very fine-grained. It's mostly silt and clay and some sand. It tends to have a lot of water in it. So as long as you keep dumping more sediment on top, as the river keeps bringing it in, you can maintain the delta. But if the sediment supply is cut off, the sediment that's already there starts to compact and subside, and it's more susceptible to coastal erosion by waves and tides, and particularly storm surges. Right. So there's this massive catastrophic loss of coastal sediment and land in Louisiana and the Mississippi Delta, and that's been going on for decades. So when you have something like Katrina and Rita, first of all, you've lost the buffering that you would have if you had coastal marshes and wetlands and a coast that had been built out. So the storm surges can be larger, they can come farther inland. And then the other major factor in Katrina and Rita was that the dependence on the artificial levees. The
Right.
flood of record in the Mississippi was in 1927, and it caused massive devastation and loss of life. So the entire focus at the national level went to building artificial levees so that this would never happen again. And I should say rivers naturally build levees, but artificial levees are those built by humans. They're usually taller and wider. And the idea is to keep the water from going out of the channel into the adjacent floodplain. So if you depend on levees, that sets up some potentially very bad scenarios. One is that wherever the levees end downstream, you can exacerbate the flooding because instead of having the floodwaters spread out across a broad valley and move slowly downstream, you're keeping them like a fire hose. They go downstream really fast and they're concentrated. Because they're moving fast and they're concentrated, they also have a lot of energy. So if the water seeps into the levees or it overtops them, those levees can erode and they can fail catastrophically. And a floodplain is like a delta in the sense that whenever the river goes out of its channel banks, some sediment is deposited. So that maintains the elevation of the floodplain through time. If you stop that process, you no longer have water going over bank. A floodplain can subside too, and particularly floodplains that historically were wetlands, we've drained and ditched, so we've caused them to subside. So in places like New Orleans, you have a scenario where people are living below the level of the channel. They're protected by those levees. But if the levees fail, then it's catastrophic, especially since the downstream levees may still be intact. So they may prevent the river water from going back into the channel. They may hold it on the floodplain that's been developed for houses or crop fields. And that's one of the things that happened in Katrina.
And you know, it's somewhat similar, or maybe this is a different phenomenon. Maybe you can help me understand. In 2017, when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, which, you know, I'm from North Texas, but I have, you know, a lot of friends and colleagues down in Houston, that hit very close to home. And the city was devastated. And at the time, what I read, it was something similar to what you're saying. There just was nowhere for the water to go because so much of the city was concrete and there just wasn't enough floodplain to absorb all of that water. And so it just stood and just caused massive devastation.
Yeah, that's another unfortunate example. Sometimes I think of any landscapes, let's say the continental US, prior to European settlement as a giant sponge.
Mm-hmm.
We had more wetlands, we had more floodplains connected to channels, we had more natural land cover and vegetation. So you could still get catastrophic flooding. And if you have a dissipating hurricane, you're going to have a big flood no matter what.
Right.
But it can be worse if you prevent that water from filtering into the ground, from spreading across the floodplains, basically from moving downstream more slowly. As you pointed out, if things are covered in concrete, there's no infiltration. It runs off the surface, it goes into the storm sewers, they dump into the rivers. You concentrate the rainfall and the runoff really effectively, and you produce bigger flood peaks. So that's one of the things that happened in Houston. So going back to that sponge analogy, if our country was a giant sponge to differing degrees, we've kind of allowed the sponge to dry out and petrify, so it's more like a rock.
Yeah.
And we've really reduced its ability to absorb water during even gentle rainfalls, let alone catastrophic ones.
And the way that relates to our rivers and streams is that we're putting way too much pressure on them, right? Like we're expecting these different channels to take all of that water out to sea or, you know, downstream wherever it leads, in a way that they never had to carry those loads before.
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of having, you know, if you are sitting in a chair listening to this and you spread your arms or your hands as far apart as they would go, maybe that was the historic floodplain. And now we've moved many rivers to a channel that's, you know, maybe your hands are 6 inches apart instead of the length of your arms. We've constricted rivers, and that makes water go faster. that gives the water more energy, and you get erosion or very large floods that are very, what hydrologists call flashy. So happens very quickly, high magnitude, and then it recedes pretty quickly.
And while ostensibly, without thinking about, I said forest for the trees earlier. Obviously, that's a figure of speech, but like without thinking about the whole system, ostensibly to somebody who isn't thinking about it too deeply or just doesn't have the background knowledge, that sounds like a good thing, right? Like, oh, we've got this like fast moving water, we can use that for energy, and we can predict, and we can we're putting it all in one place so we know exactly where it's going. But that's actually catastrophic, because there's just no way that our systems can carry the amount of energy that is increasingly put into them due to, again, our own actions, which has caused climate change to go out of control, and it's causing once in a lifetime storms to happen like once every couple of years.
Yeah, there's at least three bad things about making everything move downstream fast. One is that it's got a lot of the flowing water has a lot of energy, so it can erode and create a lot of damage. The other is that if you're in a boom and bust system, when you're bust, you don't have water. So I live in Colorado. We depend heavily on snowmelt to feed the rivers, and one of the fears with warming climate is we're going to have more rainfall and less snowmelt. So what are we going to do when we're not having rain? Do we need bigger reservoirs to try and store that water? If you can store water in the landscape in a dispersed fashion, both on the surface and in the subsurface, in floodplains, in wetlands, in natural ponds and lakes, you've got a lot more buffering for those dry times when there's not so much water available in the river. The other big downside of everything moving downstream fast, don't think about floods now, think about the normal stream flow.
Mm-hmm.
I would guess many of your listeners have heard of the dead zone that develops. It's always present, but it develops more each year in the Gulf of Mexico off the mouth of the Mississippi. We have dead zones off the mouth of many of our rivers. They're places where there's too much nitrogen.
Mm-hmm.
Nitrogen is a nutrient that all living organisms need, but we put really large amounts on our crop fields, and we emit a lot from our tailpipes or from our fossil fuel combustion. So there's an excess of nitrate that goes into rivers. And if you have too much nitrate, there's some types of organisms like blue-green algae that are very happy. They say, oh, yippee, and they have population explosions.
Right. So you get these huge blooms.
Exactly. But that creates toxins, and it also depletes the dissolved oxygen in the water. So it's called the dead zone of many of these rivers in the parts of the Gulf of Mexico, because everything else dies. Fish, shellfish, there's just not enough dissolved oxygen in the water. So we're both putting more nitrate into the rivers, but we're also speeding that nitrate downstream by keeping flow in the channel. If you have a floodplain and the water can go across the floodplain, there are usually plants, whether it's grasses, sedges and rushes, forest, that grow on the bottomlands. And the microbes that live in the soil beneath those plants are very efficient at removing excess nitrate from the soil. Mm-hmm. But if they never get access to the nitrate, it just goes downstream in this concentrated shunt. And that's what we see it showing up as dead zones off the coast of many rivers.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, there's so much. It's such a complicated system, and we've managed to do so much to affect it, in a lot of ways for the worse. But have we also managed to do some work to affect these ecosystems, maybe not, quote, for the better, whatever that means, but maybe to return them to previous states, or at least to improve their functionality? Or are we still really behind on that?
I think we're behind, but we're getting better.
Okay.
There are literally billions of dollars spent on stream restoration in the U.S. and globally every year. And my highly technical summary of stream restoration, which some people may recognize, is all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. We can't fully restore river ecosystems, but we can restore some functionality. And the degree to which we can restore them is very dependent on the situation. If you're in the middle of LA, you can't restore the whole historic floodplain because there's too much high value property there, but you can restore some of it.
Right.
There's a program in the Netherlands that is an unpronounceable Dutch word, but it translates to room for rivers. So again, they're not restoring the whole historic width of the floodplain, but they're allowing the rivers a little more space than they have at present. And that can restore a lot of ecosystem functions or benefits as well. So yes, we are definitely making progress with river restoration. We still have a long way to go, but it's not a situation for despair and hopelessness by any means.
I'm curious about, often when we talk about, well, gosh, a lot of topics on the show, we're able to talk about them globally, locally, and, sort of macro to micro to like ultra micro, for people who are living in communities, or especially if they're lucky enough. Here in the United States, this happens, and in a lot of the world, it doesn't happen because we don't have the sort of luxury of land. But here in the United States, especially in between the coasts, there are people who have land. Like they have property and, they might live on farmland, or they might live in a house that has a couple of acres of yard or something. Are there things, often I'll talk about like urban wildlife on the show and ways that people can create an urban garden in their backyard to invite more wildlife. Are there ways that people can individually contribute to sort of like wetland ecology in terms of the habitats that they have, immediate control over?
Absolutely. The less direct way, I suppose, not in terms of your own property, is most or a great many rivers in the United States have some type of watershed organization. I mean, there's the river guardians, the river keepers. Where I live, we have Friends of the Pooter. The Pooter is the local river. Find out what the opportunities are to become involved with those organizations and help. And it could be monitoring water quality or contributing to cleanups or just being a voice for the river when decisions are being made, political decisions or zoning decisions. But in your own backyard, I think one of the most important things you can do is think about the chemicals you're putting on the land. Mm-hmm. Everything that happens in the watershed of the catchment goes into a river eventually. So if you're putting excess herbicides or insecticides on your suburban lot, that's going to affect your local river. It's going to run off during rainfall or snowmelt. It's going to go into the storm sewers, and it's going to go right into the channel. Think about the same things you could do for urban wildlife, limiting your chemical use, trying to focus on native plants that may better stabilize the soil and use less water. I think those are big ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. What about catching water? Do you advocate for that, for people to catch rainwater on their properties?
Well, I'd be very hypocritical if I said no, because I do it. I have rain barrels.
Lovely.
I live in a semi-arid region. It used to be illegal to have rain barrels. The idea was we needed every drop of water to go into the storm sewer system in the rivers. But more than a decade ago, the state backed off from that. So I have a yard it's not entirely native plants, but nobody gets any supplemental water except what I catch in the rain barrels. I haven't used my in-ground sprinkler system for a long time. It's been about 5 years now. And I've become a stormwater management engineer because I spend a lot of time spreading water from the rain barrels when we do get rain. But I do that because I'm so aware of the water scarcity that's affecting our local rivers. And the water scarcity is mainly because of consumptive water use, of people withdrawing water, mostly for agriculture, but also for municipal use and urban use. So you can say, it doesn't make much difference if one person does this, but it's, I think, the standard argument. The cumulative effects of many people doing it can make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I think sometimes that is something that can be overwhelming for individuals, is the push and pull that we've received, not just from regulatory agencies, but also from industry. I mean, I don't want to get political or anything, but I think about my own personal life. I think about my friends and how we've been sort of duped by plastics industries to feel like all of the onus is on us when it comes to single-use plastics or when it comes to recycling, that it's like a consumer decision and that it's not an industry decision. And so because of that push and pull that we've been experiencing our whole lives, sometimes I think there's a learned hopelessness, and there's a, well, things are the way they are, look at what my city is doing or not doing, or look what my state is doing or not doing. There's no way I can help. There's no way I can be involved. But there is a lot that you can be empowered to do, even at that local level.
Absolutely. And I don't unfortunately remember who I heard this from, but years ago I think I was watching a movie or a video or something, and it was someone who was involved in social activism, and the interviewer said, well, how can, what gives you hope, or how can you have hope when things don't seem to be changing? And I can't even remember if it was a man or a woman who was being asked that question, but whoever it was said, well, what's the alternative? Mm-hmm. If you don't have hope and if you don't try, that's not really a viable alternative unless you're psychologically preparing to withdraw or for your own death or something. It would be a form of social or community death. Yeah. And I'm not ready to do that yet. So I think we all have to try, and we can make individual contributions that make a difference. There's no question that there are national, societal, industrial scenarios or decisions that it's hard for us to overturn, but that doesn't mean we have to be hopeless about what we can do individually.
Absolutely. And so maybe we can kind of close out the conversation, because obviously there's so much more, but there's never enough time on the show, about kind of what the benefits of restoration, the benefits of conservation of these stream and river systems are. We talked a little bit about the benefit to urban areas in preventing catastrophe, but maybe we can talk about from a global benefit all the way down to the individual, maybe even more like psychological benefit of preserving these regions.
Yeah, imagine a world where you could just reach over and cup your hand in a river and drink the water. Mm-hmm. We're not going to go back to that in many places, but imagine a world where you could live in a city and take a walk along a river and enjoy the river itself, rather than having it be an open sewage system. Mm-hmm. Imagine a world where you could go fishing and you could eat the fish in the rivers. I grew up, as I mentioned, outside of Cleveland. I don't have to imagine. I experienced a river burning. The Cuyahoga doesn't do that anymore. There's been tremendous restoration. Now there's a national recreation area in the headwaters, and it's a really nice place to go. So imagine how much better your local environment and your city and your state could be if you had healthy, functional rivers where you could go for recreation, where you could fish, where you could paddle, where you could watch birds. And then think about the global benefits of not having some of the highest extinction rates of any organisms in rivers, which is what we have right now, and of not having dead zones off the coast, and of not having increasing flood damages and loss of life to floods. I think of the positive alternatives if we cared for rivers better, and all the many benefits we would derive from those.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A lot to think about, and so much more within just within your body of work, obviously, but also within your writing, not just this book, but you've written several books now, haven't you?
I have. I care a lot about rivers, and I care a lot about communicating to people. So, who are non-scientists. So, yes, I have written several books, and I like writing, which also helps.
That's good, because it is definitely a labor of love. Well, gosh, Ellen, I can't thank you enough for sharing. I mean, as I mentioned, for just the work that you've been doing throughout your incredible career, but also for taking the time today for sharing some of your insights with us, and hopefully inspiring several of us who, maybe we have a local river and maybe it's time to go visit it again if it's been a while, or you have a stream, even on your property, but you just haven't. You've been too busy to get back down there just to go and appreciate these, incredible natural phenomena, and also start thinking about how we can contribute to the conservation of these wonderful systems.
Thank you very much. it's been really fun for me, and I'm glad to get the chance to talk to people about rivers.
I'm glad to hear it. And everybody, the book is Following the Bend, How to Read a River and Understand Its Nature by Dr. Ellen Wohl. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.